They said that on the edge of that town stood a house so cheap no one dared keep it, because whenever winter returned, the strange rumors rose with it. But for a former Navy SEAL and his loyal German shepherd, other people's fear only made him want to face the truth with his own eyes. From the moment he arrived in town, he could feel the unnatural silence hiding behind every joke, as if everyone knew something was wrong with that house, but no one had the courage to say it all. This is not only a story about a mysterious house, but also a story about instinct, courage, and how even a dead end can become the place that keeps people alive. Because behind a hidden wall beneath the basement was an old steel door and a short passage that led nowhere. Yet it was enough to make Kalen understand that this house had never simply been forgotten. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can continue bringing you more meaningful stories. And now, let's begin the story. By the time Kalen Voss crossed the county line into Briar's End, the daylight had already begun its slow winter retreat. The northern sky had that peculiar brightness that belonged only to cold country, a pale, glassy light stretched thin over endless snow, as if the sun had grown tired and brittle and might crack if the wind hit it too hard. Pines stood along the road in dark ranks, their branches burdened with white. The lake somewhere beyond the tree line could not yet be seen, but its presence was felt in the air. A deep, mineral cold that came clean off Superior and slipped through the seams of a truck door, patient as memory. Kalen drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the old military watch on his wrist, not because he needed to check the time, but because old habits stayed where grief and discipline stored them. He was 35, tall at just about 6 feet, with the kind of lean, contained strength that did not advertise itself. Nothing about him was soft, yet nothing about him was theatrical either. He had the body of a man who had spent years teaching muscle to obey silently. His face was clean-shaven, the jaw square and bare, the cheekbones sharp under skin made light by birth, but roughened and darkened by wind, winter, and too many climates that asked a man to endure first and feel later. His hair, dark brown and cut in a military style just slightly longer than strict regulation, had grown enough to stop looking active duty, but not enough to forget it once was. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, and unhurried. They gave strangers the uncomfortable impression that he was listening even when he said nothing at all. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Orion. The German shepherd was 6 years old, large without heaviness, with a sable coat that carried cream, gray, and black through the thick winter fur. The darker markings gathered over his back and muzzle, while the lighter fur at his neck and chest caught the weak daylight like old straw under snow. His ears stayed upright even when he looked half asleep, and his amber-brown eyes missed very little. He wore a black harness edged in a dark, subdued red that looked almost black unless the light struck it right. Orion was not a restless dog, and not an anxious one. He had the watchful composure of an animal that had spent years beside a man who respected quiet more than comfort. When he was unsettled, he did not bark first. He noticed first. And now he was noticing. Kalen had seen the change 20 miles back. Orion had stopped sleeping. He sat upright, nose tilted faintly toward the vents, reading the air through scent and pressure in ways no human could learn. Twice he had looked toward the north side of the road for no clear reason. The movement had been slight. Another person might have missed it. Kalen did not. "You feel it too?" he asked. Orion's ears twitched, but the dog kept watching the snow-dark trees. Kalen did not smile often, but something close to one touched the corner of his mouth. The road ahead bent west, and Briar's End appeared not with drama, but with the modesty of places that had never expected to be looked at by outsiders. A row of storefronts, a gas station whose sign hummed faintly in the cold, a church steeple with a dusting of white along one side. Pickup trucks parked at angles that suggested the people here believed in function before beauty, but not so completely that they had forgotten beauty altogether. He slowed as he reached Main Street. Briar's End looked almost offensively peaceful. Christmas lights still clung to a few eaves, though the holiday had long passed. Smoke rose in thin blue ribbons from chimneys. The sidewalks had been shoveled neatly, and the plowed banks at the curb were piled like small frozen waves. The town was the kind of place that appeared in calendars and insurance commercials. Quiet, decent, bright in the hard way winter could be bright. It was precisely the sort of place where a man could almost believe life was willing to begin again. Almost. Kalen parked outside the real estate office first. The woman inside had already locked the door, but saw him through the glass and let him in with the weary kindness of someone used to people arriving 5 minutes too late. She was a simple secondary figure in the day, older, wrapped in a charcoal cardigan, with silver reading glasses and a narrow, practical face that suggested she had spent a lifetime filing other people's bad decisions into cabinets. She handed over the keys, the folder, and a map marked with the property line and winter access road. "You're Mr. Voss," she said. "Kalen." She nodded. "You really went through with it." There was no judgment in her voice. If anything, there was the faintest note of pity. He glanced at the folder. "That unusual around here?" Her mouth tightened. "Not unusual. Just rare. People tour that property in summer. They back out before winter." He let the silence hang until she filled it. "The house sits close to the North Ridge," she said. "Drifts harder than the others. Access gets messy some years. And the old owners left behind enough stories to make cautious people act cautious." Stories? Now she almost smiled, though not from humor. "Ask in town. They'll tell it better." Kalen thanked her, took the keys, and left. He could have gone straight to the house then. That would have been the efficient thing. But daylight was dropping. The temperature had a sharp new edge in it, and he needed stove fuel, batteries, and a proper look at the road conditions. More than that, he wanted to hear the town say the house's name without paperwork between them. So he went to June Alder's diner. The bell over the door gave a bright little ring when he entered, and a wave of warmth, coffee, and frying butter rolled over him like a memory from another life. Orion stepped in at his heel without hesitation, nails ticking softly on old wood, before settling into the patience of a trained dog. June Alder looked up from behind the counter. She was in her early 40s, with chestnut brown hair gathered loosely back, a face made vivid by warmth rather than prettiness, and the capable hands of a woman who had spent half her life carrying plates, wiping counters, and stitching tired people briefly back together with soup and caffeine. Her skin held the healthy color of someone used to heat indoors and cold outdoors, and her eyes were sharp enough to suggest little escaped her, but kind enough not to make that fact unbearable. She wore a thick cream sweater under a dark brown apron, and when she smiled, it was with the ease of someone who had seen many kinds of strangers and had no need to be impressed by any of them. "Well," she said, drying her hands on a towel, "either you're lost, or you're the one who bought the Hale place." Kalen pulled off his gloves. "That obvious? In a town this size?" She leaned one hip against the counter. "Honey, a new truck on Main Street is news. A new man with a military spine and a German shepherd is practically a parade. A soft laugh passed through two men at the far booth. Kalen glanced their way, not defensive, just aware. One was broad-shouldered and red-cheeked with a mechanic's hands gone black at the creases, younger than Kalen by a few years, easy in posture, quick in expression. This, he would learn, was Eli Mercer. The other, seated farther back with the heavy stillness of someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice, was Sheriff Nolan Pike. Nolan looked to be in his late 40s, wide through the shoulders and chest, not fat, but substantial, with weather lines at the eyes, and a face built out of endurance rather than elegance. His dark coat hung open over a duty sweater, and his watchfulness had the practical, unsentimental shape of lawmen in small places, cautious, patient, and tired in a permanent way. June poured coffee before Kalen asked for it. "You sit, dog too." "Appreciate it." Orion lowered himself at Kalen's boots, but not fully. He kept his head up. June noticed. "He's handsome." "He knows it." That brought the faintest flicker of amusement to her face. "What's his name?" "Orion." "Big name." "He grew into it." The mechanic Eli rose halfway from his booth, grinning in the way of men who make a joke before deciding if they'll trust you. "You really bought that place out by the ridge? The one with the noises?" June gave him a look. "Don't start." "I'm not starting. I'm informing." Eli spread his hands. He was around 30, solid from physical work, with wind-reddened skin, a crooked, likable face, and brown blonde hair shoved into disorder by a beanie he now held in one fist. "You should know what you paid for." Kalen wrapped both hands around the mug. "That why everybody backed out?" "That and the location," June said. "Northside Drift gets ugly." Nolan Pike spoke for the first time, his voice low and even. "The house had a porch collapse in a bad winter 6 years back. Nobody died, but the story stuck. Folks don't like risk when there are easier properties around." Eli leaned against the counter's end. "And because every winter somebody hears things." Kalen looked at him. "What things?" Eli shrugged, but his grin thinned a little. "Depends who's telling it. Knocking under the floor, metal sounds, wind where there shouldn't be wind. Old Mrs. Perrin used to swear the house breathed when snow got deep enough." June cut in. "And old Mrs. Perrin swore her tomatoes grew better when insulted, so let's weigh sources accordingly." That earned a genuine laugh from the room. But Kalen noticed something then, not the jokes themselves, but the way the laughter died just a little too quickly. Not fear, exactly. Something milder and more stubborn. The town didn't believe in ghosts. The town believed in inconvenience, in accidents, in winter making fools of confident people. That was often more dangerous than superstition. He sipped the coffee. It was strong, hot, and honest. "I read the disclosure," he said. "There's mention of some unfinished underground structure." Nolan's eyes lifted fully to him now. "You read it carefully, then." "I tend to." "Old owner had some work done under there years ago," Nolan said. "No one seems to know exactly what for. County record calls it a partial utility shelter. No current certification. One reason the bank priced the place the way they did." Eli grinned again, though not as brightly. "That's the polite version. The impolite one is everybody thinks old Merrick Hale spent too much time listening to the ground." June rested her forearms on the counter. "Merrick wasn't crazy." "No," Eli admitted. "Just strange." The word stayed in the air. Kalen had met many versions of strange, men who heard mortars in car backfires, men who slept with shoes on, men who said very little because language had once failed them in places where failure cost blood. Strange was often just pain made socially inconvenient. He glanced down at Orion. The dog had gone utterly still. Not tense, not frightened. Still in the way predators and trained animals became still when some distant, inaudible thing slid into alignment. Kalen followed Orion's gaze. The diner windows looked out across Main Street toward a line of rooftops white with gathered snow. Beyond them, the faint rise of the North Ridge under the last of the light. Nothing moved there. The sky was pale gold near the horizon and deepening to steel above. Orion stood slowly, walked 2 steps toward the window, and put his nose near the glass. The whole diner noticed. For one brief moment, small, strange, easy to laugh off if anyone wanted, nobody said a word. Then June let out a breath through her nose. "Well," she said lightly, "that's not eerie at all." The room chuckled, and the spell broke. But Kalen felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not yet, only that old internal click by which instinct announced itself before thought caught up. It was the same sensation he had learned to trust on patrol, in buildings, on roads, in villages too quiet at the wrong hour. Sometimes danger did not arrive. Sometimes a place merely introduced itself honestly. And something in Briar's End, or in the ridge above it, had just done exactly that. He rose after a few more minutes, paid, and thanked June. She slid a paper sack of sandwiches across the counter before he could protest. "For later," she said. "You won't have your kitchen sorted tonight." "I can pay for those?" "You did, by looking like you needed them." Eli held the door as he left. "If you hear the floor knocking, just knock back. Maybe the house is lonely." June threw a towel at him. He dodged it, laughing. Outside, the cold met Kalen cleanly. He took the bag, the keys, the coffee still warming his chest, and led Orion back to the truck. Behind him, Briar's End glowed gently into evening windows lit, smoke rising. All of it lovely enough to make a man suspicious if he had lived long enough. He started the engine and drove north. The farther he went from Main Street, the quieter the world became. Houses thinned. Pines thickened. Snowbanks rose higher along the roadside. At last he turned onto the access lane marked on the map, narrow but passable, curving toward the ridge through darkening woods. Then he saw the house. It stood where the trees opened, old but not ruined, set a little apart from the world, as if it had not been forgotten, so much as gradually surrendered. The roofline leaned under gathered snow. The siding had weathered to a tired gray-brown. One section of porch had clearly been rebuilt at some point, and then neglected afterward. The windows reflected the dying sky like cold coins. Nothing about it was dramatic. Nothing about it needed to be. Orion did not jump out when Kalen opened the truck door. He stepped down, but slowly. The dog stood beside the front bumper, ears forward, gaze not on the house itself, but somewhere beyond it, toward the dark rise of land at the back, where wind had carved long ripples into the snow, and the first shadows of evening pooled blue among the drifts. Kalen shut the truck door and listened. No voices, no engines, no birds. Only that northern silence, wide and absolute, as if the whole property had inhaled and held it. He looked at the key in his gloved hand, then at the old house waiting under the coming dark. A cheap house, a tidy town, a ridge full of snow, and a dog who had never hesitated at an open door until now. "All right," he murmured, though whether to Orion, to the house, or to himself, even he could not have said. Together, they walked toward the porch. The front steps complained under Kalen's weight, not loudly, not with the rotten, dangerous groan of wood about to fail. Just a dry protest, old timber tightening against cold, the kind of sound a man could catalog and dismiss in a second if he wanted to. Kalen did not dismiss it. He cataloged everything. He unlocked the front door with his left hand, while the paper sack from June hung from his wrist. Orion stayed close behind him, not crowding, not pushing past. The dog's breath came in pale ribbons through the dark, and when the door finally opened inward, a sealed-up smell rolled out into the evening air dust, cold wood, old plaster, and that faint mineral dampness old northern houses gathered in their bones after too many winters. Kalen paused on the threshold. A house always told the truth first through smell. This one smelled neglected, but not dead. There was no deep rot. No rodent infestation so heavy it had claimed the walls. No mold bloom thick enough to turn the air sweet and dangerous. It was a place that had been left alone longer than it should have been, but not yet abandoned to ruin. That difference mattered. He reached along the wall until he found the switch plate. Nothing happened. Not a surprise. The real estate file had warned him the power had been connected only to the line, not fully restored inside. He set the sandwich bag down on a narrow entry table striped with dust, drew a flashlight from his coat pocket, and sent a clean white beam through the front room. The living room emerged by pieces. A stone hearth. 2 windows looking west, blue now with the last of evening. An old couch under a sheet. A bookshelf built into one wall. Pine floorboards dulled with grime, but straight. The room was smaller than it had looked in the listing photos, and somehow more honest. Houses often shrank when you met them in person. This one did not shrink so much as stop pretending. Orion stepped inside at last. His nails clicked softly over the floor, measured and deliberate. He lowered his head, taking in the room through scent before judgment. His body remained loose, but not relaxed. He moved through the living room in a slow arc, pausing once by the hearth, once near the hallway, once at the opening that led toward the kitchen. Then he stood still and listened. Kalen closed the door behind them. The quiet changed immediately. Outside silence was open and wide, held by trees and snow and distance. Inside silence became close, structured. It seemed to settle between walls and under furniture, not empty but occupied by years of weather, waiting, and whatever a place kept when no one had been there long enough to witness it. He had lived in barracks, half-built compounds, cement rooms overseas, temporary safe houses with cracked tiles, and one naked bulb hanging from a wire. He had slept in structures that shook under artillery 3 valleys away, and in mud-walled homes where an old woman had fed him lentils while pretending not to fear the rifle slung over his shoulder. A building, to him, was never neutral. It either wanted to hold together, or it did not. This one wanted to hold together. He set his pack down by the couch and began the slow first circuit any practical man made in a new property. Windows, locks, ceiling stains, drafts, door frames, evidence of shifting. He checked the kitchen next, small, square, outdated, but serviceable. a narrow sink under a window. Old cabinets painted a tired cream that had yellowed with time. The stove would need cleaning. The refrigerator looked like it had last been trusted by someone who still wrote checks for groceries. His flashlight passed over the floor. There. A cold patch. Not visible. Felt. He stopped, lowered his gloved hand toward the boards, and held it there a few seconds. The air just above one section of floor near the far end of the kitchen was noticeably colder than the rest. Subtle, but real. Not a draft off the window. Not from the back door either. It rose from below. He straightened slowly. "Noted," he murmured. Orion had come to stand beside him. The dog's ears were forward now, and he gave one small sniff toward the lower cabinets, then another toward the floor itself. Kalen moved on without comment. He found the water shut off but the pipes intact, at least at first glance. The back mudroom leaned slightly and had taken more winter punishment than the front half of the house, exactly as the report suggested. Upstairs there were 2 small bedrooms, both stripped nearly bare. The north bedroom window had frost feathering its inner corners, despite the house being unheated, which told him something about how poorly that wall was insulated. The bathroom was cramped, but not hopeless. The roofline from inside looked sound. When he came back down, full dark had settled outside. He built a temporary pool of order in the living room, the way some men built prayer. One object placed carefully after another. Pack by couch. Flashlight on table. Extra batteries near the wall. Knife, folded. Thermos. Water. June's sandwiches unwrapped and shared half for him. A small portion for Orion. The routine calmed him, not because he was afraid, but because structure gave thought a shape to lean against. He sat on the sheet-covered couch to eat. The bread was still a little warm in the center. Ham, mustard, sharp cheddar. Too generous for a town he had entered only an hour earlier. He ate slowly, watching the dark windows reflect the room back at him. He had not told anyone in Briar's End the full truth about why he had bought the house. The cheap price had mattered, of course. So had the distance. So had the ridge, the silence, the lack of neighbors close enough to ask questions through hedges. But beneath those practical reasons was a quieter one he rarely put into words, even for himself. He had spent enough years belonging to mission schedules, chain of command, and places where every door was temporary. He had wanted one thing that was his because he chose it, not because it was assigned, needed, briefed, defended, or survived. A house was a modest kind of claim. A man bought land not because he believed he could own the earth, but because sometimes he needed to believe he could stand somewhere without being borrowed by it. Orion finished eating first, licked once at the edge of the bowl, then crossed the room toward the hallway. He did not go upstairs. He did not go to the front door. He stopped at a narrow door near the kitchen. Basement. The dog stood there, with his head slightly lowered, not tense enough to alarm, but attentive in the deep, fixed way that always meant he was listening to more than sound. His tail remained still. His ears made one precise adjustment. Kalen watched him for a few seconds, then rose and picked up the flashlight. The basement door opened inward with a dry scrape. Cold air drifted up immediately. Earth cold, different from house cold. The steps below were wooden and steep, descending into a darkness that seemed thicker than the rest of the house deserved. "All right," he said softly. He went first. Orion followed close. The basement was unfinished, low-ceilinged, and larger than he had expected, though part of that impression came from how little was left in it. Shelving leaned against one wall. Plastic bins, old paint cans, a broken sled, the remains of holiday decorations in a torn cardboard box, silver tinsel escaping like something brittle and dead. Concrete floor, stone foundation in places, newer repair work in others. It smelled of dust, faint mildew, and trapped winter. Kalen swept the beam from wall to wall. Nothing moved. He crouched near the furnace unit, checked the visible lines, then followed the foundation edge slowly. That was when the second thing struck him. Not with sight, but with sound. Or rather, with the lack of the right sound. His footsteps did not return the way they should have. In an unfinished basement of this size, the echo ought to have been short and simple. Instead, some parts of the room gave back a dull, immediate answer, while others swallowed the sound and returned it strangely softened, as though the wall beyond was not as solid as it pretended to be. Kalen stopped, turned, walked again. Orion had not wandered. The dog was standing near the far corner now, past the shelving unit, where the wall looked no different from the others except for a panel of old beadboard that did not match the age or material around it. Kalen crossed the room. The shelving unit there held almost nothing useful mason jars, one rusted lantern, a box of warped magazines, and a cracked ceramic bowl. Dust lay thick on everything but thinner near the floor behind it, as if the shelf had been moved once, long ago, and shoved back without care. He set down the flashlight, gripped one side of the unit, and dragged it a few inches. The scrape was loud enough to wake the whole house. Behind it, the wall paneling showed its lie more clearly. Nails newer than the surrounding wood. Slight seam. Different grain. He ran his thumb along the edge. Orion gave a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, not warning exactly. Recognition, maybe. If a dog could recognize a secret rather than understand it, that was the sound it might make. Kalen stood very still. Then he heard it. A faint knock. 3 taps. He did not move. The sound did not come again. He looked at the pipes overhead. Contracting metal in the cold, maybe. A shift in old boards. Any house in this temperature could make noises strange enough to invite imagination in. But the timing was too sharp, too placed, arriving exactly when his hand touched the seam in the false wall. For one brief instant, a memory flashed through him, an Afghan compound, the hollow note behind stacked crates, the knowledge of a hidden cavity before anyone else in the room had seen it. His body remembered before his mind consented to remember. That was the way with old training. It lived beneath conscious thought like a second skeleton. He exhaled once and pulled a flat tool from his pack upstairs. By the time he returned to the basement, the air felt colder. Not dramatically. Not storybook cold. Just enough that the skin along the back of his neck noticed. He wedged the tool into the seam and pried carefully. The first strip of beadboard gave with a brittle crack. Behind it was darkness, and a few inches deeper, steel. Not modern bright steel. Older. Matte. Functional. Kalen removed more of the paneling, section by section, until a narrow metal door revealed itself fully from the wall. It was painted a dull industrial gray, almost swallowed by dust. No visible handle outside except a recessed lever and a small mechanical latch assembly long disused. Not decorative, not improvised. It had been built to matter. Orion stepped closer, but did not touch it. Kalen brushed dust from the lever. The metal beneath his glove was colder than the surrounding room. He tried the latch first. It resisted, then gave half an inch. The lever took more force. Something inside dragged with a reluctant clank, and the door opened inward a narrow distance before catching against the floor. A concealed threshold. He widened the gap enough to send the flashlight beam through. A passage sloped down beyond it, tighter than a hallway, lined in old concrete and reinforced at intervals with steel brackets. The air that came from inside was still, dry, and colder than the basement. Not cave air, not exactly, structured air, held air, the kind that belonged to enclosed spaces cut off from ordinary use. Kalen widened the opening another inch and crouched to see farther. The corridor went down only a short stretch before ending abruptly in blockage, a compacted wall of concrete rubble and old timber bracing, as if the original passage had either collapsed or been intentionally sealed off before completion. But the section between the hidden door and the blocked end was real, engineered, deliberate. On the right side, midway down, he caught the outline of mounting bolts in the wall, where shelves or equipment might once have been fixed. On the ceiling, near the corner, a circular vent opening no wider than his fist sat capped with rust. He did not step inside. Not yet. Instead, he sat back on his heels and let the shape of it settle in his mind. Not a tunnel in the dramatic sense. Not a route out. A short underground chamber or access passage, substantial enough to have required money, labor, and secrecy. Too serious for storage, too hidden for convenience, too contained to be accidental. A partial utility shelter, Nolan Pike had called it. That was one way to name a thing when no one wanted to admit they didn't know what it was for. Kalen reached one hand out and laid it flat against the concrete beside the doorway. Solid. Little moisture. No immediate flaking. He tested the floor at the threshold. Stable enough. He angled the light along the ceiling and saw hairline cracks in one section, but old ones, not fresh. Orion sat down beside him at last. That alone told Kalen almost as much as the structure did. If the dog had been frightened, he would have remained standing, weight forward, ready. Sitting meant something else. Not safety, exactly. Interest without panic. Kalen looked once more into the hidden passage, then back at the false wall pieces scattered over the basement floor. People did not hide useless things this carefully. Upstairs, the house gave a quiet, settling sigh in the cold. He turned off the flashlight for one moment, just to feel the darkness honestly. It was complete. The basement vanished. The hidden passage vanished. Orion became only warmth beside his leg, and the soft, measured sound of a living animal breathing. Somewhere overhead, the winter night pressed itself against old siding and window glass. In that blackness, Kalen felt again the same strange sensation he had known at the diner and on the porch. Not fear, but the unmistakable awareness that he had stepped into a place with a history of being underestimated. He turned the flashlight back on. For now, that was enough. He closed the steel door as far as it would go, not sealing it, just returning the secret to silence until daylight. Then he picked up the broken paneling and leaned it roughly back into place. It no longer hid anything from him, but it hid enough from the room. When he finally climbed the basement stairs with Orion at his side, he did so knowing the house had changed in a way that mattered. Not because it was haunted, not because town gossip had proved larger than reason, because beneath the ordinary bones of a cheap old house at the edge of a winter town, someone had built something serious, then hidden it well enough that only cold, patience, and a dog that listened too closely had brought it back into the light. And standing in the kitchen again, one hand resting on the old counter, Kalen realized he was no longer thinking of the place as a property. He was thinking of it as a question. Kalen did not sleep much that first night. He stretched out on the old couch without bothering to remove the dust sheet completely, one arm folded across his chest, the other resting loosely near the flashlight on the table. Orion lay on the floor beside him, not fully asleep either. The shepherd's body curved, but his ears never entirely surrendering to rest. Outside, the cold settled harder over the property. The house adjusted to it in small, private sounds timbers, drawing inward, a faint complaint somewhere in the ceiling, a whisper at the windows when the wind tested the glass. None of that kept Kalen awake. What kept him awake was the shape of the hidden passage in his mind. He had seen enough improvised shelters, fortified rooms, and half-finished escape routes to know the difference between paranoia and planning. Panic was sloppy. Fear nailed boards over windows and called it strategy. The thing beneath this house had not been built in panic. Even unfinished, it had a seriousness to it. Somebody had measured before pouring concrete. Somebody had budgeted steel into a space no one was meant to admire. Somebody had intended the place to matter. By dawn, the house was pale with cold light. Kalen rose before the sun fully cleared the ridge. His breath did not show inside, but the air held that sharp, early chill that made fabric feel stiff and metal unkind. He boiled water on his camp stove in the kitchen, poured coffee into a steel mug, and stood at the back window watching the land slowly emerge. Snow lay in a long, untouched sheet behind the house, broken only by the dark ribs of fence posts and the shoulder of the ridge rising beyond. In daylight, the place looked less eerie and more honest. Not friendly, just honest. That made him trust it a little more. Orion ate, drank, and then stood by the mudroom door with the quiet expectation of routine. Kalen took him outside first. Morning in Briar's End's outskirts had a clean severity to it. The snow gave back the light so fiercely it made the sky seem bluer than it was. The cold moved across exposed skin, like something with intention. Orion ranged the yard in a disciplined pattern, nose low, reading the property through scent. He paused along the back foundation, then circled toward the north side of the house where the wind had stacked the drift deeper. Kalen followed at an easy pace, boots breaking crusted snow. The back of the house showed the story of hard winters more clearly than the front. One section of the rear porch had newer boards silvered by exposure. The mudroom steps leaned slightly. The slope of the land behind the house funneled wind in a way he did not like. Snow had feathered up against the siding in places where it should not have reached so quickly. This matched what he had been told in town. The North Ridge caught and redirected weather in ugly ways. Then Orion stopped in. He stood near a shallow swell in the snow about 15 feet from the rear wall, head tilted, nostrils working. He pawed once, then once more, sharper this time. Kalen came over and crouched. At first he saw nothing but wind-hardened snow. He brushed it away with a gloved hand and struck metal beneath. A pipe cap. Old. Narrow. Half buried and painted once in a color long surrendered to rust and weather. He cleared more of it carefully. The pipe angled down toward the house. "Vent," he said quietly. Orion looked at him, ears up. That explained part of it already. Not the whole design, but enough to sharpen the outline in his head. The hidden chamber below had not been built as some eccentric storage crawl space. It had air exchange in mind. Whoever made it expected people to occupy it long enough to need breathing room. Back inside, Kalen went straight to the basement. In daylight, the space felt more practical and less theatrical, which was good. He distrusted mysteries that dissolved entirely in sunlight, but he also distrusted those that depended too much on night. Real things stayed real in the morning. He pulled the shelving unit all the way aside this time. He removed the remaining false paneling with patient force rather than caution. The steel door stood exposed now in its dull gray, stripped of secrecy, but not of weight. He wedged it open farther than before and stepped inside with the flashlight in one hand and a pry bar in the other. The narrow chamber answered the light without surprise. It was short, no more than a small access corridor, descending into a reinforced pocket beneath the house and into the rise of land beyond it. The concrete walls were rough but intentional. Metal anchor plates were set at intervals. The floor had been poured level, not merely scraped from dirt. Dust lay thick, but not in the chaotic way of long abandonment. The place felt sealed, not ruined. At the far end, the blocked section made more sense up close. It was not a dramatic cave-in. It was a halted effort. Concrete, timber bracing, and rock met each other in the awkward language of work that had been stopped before completion or redirected after trouble. He crouched beside the obstruction and shone the beam along the seams. The timbers were old, dry, and not freshly stressed. The rubble had settled years ago, maybe decades. This had not failed yesterday. It had simply never become what someone first intended. Kalen ran a gloved hand over one wall and felt the small, regular marks where brackets had once been mounted. On the left side, near shoulder height, he found 3 bolt holes in a neat line. On the right, lower down, a rectangular discoloration showed where a cabinet or utility box might once have hung. Above him, the capped vent from the backyard pipe linked neatly into the chamber ceiling. He lowered the flashlight and stood in the stillness, a dead end. But not a meaningless one. That thought stayed with him all morning. By noon he was in town again, this time with questions instead of first impressions. He began at the small municipal records office, where the warmth smelled of paper, radiator heat, and old ink. The clerk on duty was a spare man in his 60s, with a narrow mustache and the stooped posture of someone who had spent a career leaning over counters. His name was Walter Bryn, and he wore a brown cardigan buttoned too high over a plaid shirt. His politeness had the slightly formal shape of people who had lived in one town so long they measured outsiders first by whether they respected documents. Kalen asked about old permits for the Hale property. Walter squinted through bifocals, disappeared into a back room, and returned with a thin folder that looked insultingly inadequate for the amount of thought it had already cost Kalen. "Not much here," Walter said. "Original deed, repair amendments, winter damage claim from the porch collapse, and this." He unfolded a brittle sheet, more diagram than blueprint. Kalen studied it. The drawing showed the basement footprint, and beneath one section a marked subgrade utility refuge extending partly toward the rear rise. Not a tunnel all the way out. Not a bunker in any dramatic military sense. A reinforced chamber with a planned service extension that had been crossed out in pencil. Someone had later noted in cramped handwriting, "Rear excavation terminated due to unstable ground and cost overrun." Kalen read that line twice. Not because it surprised him, but because it made the thing below the house suddenly human. Not madness. Budget. Soil condition. Compromise. The most ordinary forces in the world. "Who was Merrick Hale?" he asked. Walter made a face like someone trying to choose between rumor and fairness. Surveyman. Groundworks, seasonal measurements, odd contracts around the lake region. Smart, kept to himself. People called him strange because he listened more than he explained. That description stirred no mockery in Kalen. He had known men whose silence came from arrogance, and men whose silence came from seeing too much to waste words on the obvious. He wondered which kind Merrick Hale had been. From there, he walked to the library, a small brick building with deep windows, and the solemn hush of underused places. The woman at the front desk pointed him toward the local history shelves, and, after hearing the address, told him he might also want to speak to Martha Wren if he saw her in town. "She remembers everybody," the librarian said, "or remembers enough to make you wish she'd say the rest." Kalen found what little there was in old newspaper clippings. A mention of Merrick Hale assisting with winter ground stability surveys after a severe season decades earlier. A short article about hazardous drifts near the North Ridge. One line in a civic bulletin about private reinforcement work on Hale's property being non-residential in character. Nothing dramatic. But taken together, it formed a man, technically minded, locally tolerated, not fully understood. By the time Kalen stepped back outside, the sky had gone from bright, hard blue to the flatter white that preceded evening cloud. He crossed Main Street toward June's diner, not because he was hungry yet, but because she was the kind of person who listened first and judged later. June was refilling sugar jars when he entered. She glanced up, read something in his face, and poured coffee without asking. "You found something," she said. He sat at the counter. "More like I found what it isn't. That sounds promising. It's not a tunnel out." He set the copied notes beside his mug. "It's a reinforced chamber. Planned extension stopped because the ground wasn't stable enough, and the cost got ugly." June rested one elbow on the counter. In daylight, she looked less like a comforting figure in a warm diner, and more like what she really was, a woman who had built a life through repetition, disappointment, and the discipline of staying kind anyway. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, not from age alone, but from the habit of squinting into weather, into people, into years that didn't always return what they took. "That sounds less crazy than folks made it out to be." "Most things do, once paperwork gets involved." She smiled at that. Then the bell over the door rang, and Martha Wren came in. She was small enough that the winter coat seemed to carry her rather than the other way around, a narrow old woman wrapped in gray wool and a faded green scarf. Her hair was white, gathered back in a thin knot, and her face had that delicate, weathered sharpness some people acquired not from softness, but from surviving long enough to become light around the edges. Her eyes were pale, clear, and unsettlingly direct. She looked at Kalen once, then at the notes on the counter, and said without greeting, "You bought Merrick's house." Not a question. "Yes." Martha removed her gloves finger by finger. "Then you found the room." June blinked. "You knew?" Martha settled onto a stool with the grave patience of the very old. "I knew there was a room, not because he showed me. Merrick Hale never showed anybody what he was proud of, but because my husband helped haul cement one spring and came home angry about being paid to carry bags for a thing he wasn't allowed to ask about." Kalen turned slightly toward her. "What did Hale think it was for?" Martha's gaze drifted toward the diner window, though whether she was looking at the street or some year long gone, Kalen could not tell. He thought the north side of town was too trusting, said people saw winter as scenery until it leaned on the wrong wall. Her mouth tightened, not with bitterness, but with memory. Folks laughed because the chamber didn't go anywhere. Merrick said that was the point. Not every safe place has to lead out. Sometimes all it has to do is hold. For a moment, nobody spoke. June, who usually had something ready, simply stood there with both hands around the coffee pot. That was the re-hook the afternoon offered. Not a dramatic revelation, not a ghostly sign, but the sudden weight of a dead man's idea surviving in another living voice. Something about it struck Kalen harder than he expected. Maybe because he understood too well what it meant to build for a danger other people preferred to mock. Maybe because the phrase sometimes all it has to do is hold did not sound like architecture alone. It sounded like a life. Martha looked back at him. "Did the house catch you yet?" Kalen frowned. "Catch me?" In the silence, she pulled off her scarf. "Some places do. You walk in thinking you've bought timber and land, but the place has been waiting for a certain kind of person. Not magic." She gave June a small, irritated glance, preempting any joke. "Just fit." Kalen did not answer immediately, because embarrassingly enough, he knew what she meant. Not in any supernatural sense. He did not believe the house had chosen him. But he had felt, from the moment he stepped inside, that the place expected practical hands and a patient eye. It was a structure built by one kind of mind and found by another. Sometimes that was coincidence. Sometimes coincidence was only a tidy word for recognition. He left the diner before dark, carrying more than he had arrived with. Copies of the record sketch, a name fleshed into a man, and one sentence from an old woman that lodged deeper than he wanted to admit. Back at the house, he spent the last of the light testing the mudroom threshold and checking the rear grade. That was when the small incident happened. Small enough not to count as danger, large enough to matter. A slab of compacted roof snow and ice sheared loose above the backside with no warning. It came down not in a cinematic crash, but in a brutal, heavy slide, slamming against the drift by the back steps and packing the narrow exit path in seconds. The impact shook the mudroom wall and sent a hard white burst across his boots. Kalen stepped back instantly, pulling Orion with him by the harness as the last of the ice chunks dropped. Then silence. He stood there breathing through the cold, staring at what had just happened. The back door was not destroyed. The house was not threatened. But the lesson was clean and immediate. Under the wrong conditions, a routine exit could become a sealed edge of snow and weight with very little warning. Nothing apocalyptic. Just winter asserting itself with enough force to trap the inattentive. Orion stared at the blocked steps, then looked up at Kalen. Kalen exhaled, long and slow. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I see it." That night, as darkness thickened around the house and the cold settled in again, he returned to the hidden chamber beneath the basement, not to marvel at it, but to measure. Not every dead end was useless. Some were built precisely because there might come a day when going nowhere was the only reason a person lived. The work began the next morning, and continued because there was no reason for it not to. That was how Kalen Voss approached most things that mattered. Not with speeches, not with grand declarations to an empty room. He woke before full light, drank coffee standing up, fed Orion, looked once at the ridge behind the house, and then started making lists. A shelter was only as useful as its dullest detail. By the third day, the hidden chamber beneath the basement had stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like a problem set. Moisture first, air second, structure third, then power, heat, supplies, access, and time. There was a comfort in that order. Chaos wanted to arrive all at once, but preparation always came one quiet task after another. He stripped the loose remains of the false wall away and cleaned the narrow entry corridor properly. Dust rose in gray swirls under the flashlight beam. The old concrete walls, once wiped down, revealed themselves more clearly scarred in places, but fundamentally sound. The chamber was not large. It did not need to be. It was long enough for storage, deep enough to hide a person from weather, and serious enough in its construction that Kalen felt respect for the dead man who had understood what the ridge might one day do. Above ground, the world remained beautiful enough to make caution look foolish. Briar's End wore winter well. The town moved through cold with practiced grace, in pickup trucks salted white along the wheel wells, in wool hats and heavy boots, in short conversations held beside gas pumps, while breath smoked between words. The snow along Main Street glittered under noon sun, as if danger itself had decided to dress pleasantly. Children still flung themselves from sleds down the lower hill near the church. Store windows glowed amber in the late afternoon. The lake wind came sharp and clean. It was hard, in weather like that, to convince anyone that trouble could arrive through something as ordinary as accumulation. Kalen drove into town often that week. Not every day, but enough to become visible. He bought sealant, a portable battery station, heavy plastic bins, bottled water, canned soup, first aid supplies, weather stripping, batteries, a compact radio, 2 thick wool blankets, and enough dry food for Orion to last longer than optimism. He picked up a second-hand electric heater from a hardware consignment shelf and 2 folding cots from a man outside town who insisted on helping load them, despite a shoulder that clearly hurt him. People noticed. By the second trip, Eli Mercer was waiting outside the auto shop when Kalen parked across the street. Eli was built like a man who had grown up lifting engines before he was old enough to understand their cost. He had broad, capable hands, a square grin that came too easily, and the loose physical confidence of someone accustomed to making himself useful with little planning and plenty of faith. He wore the same canvas work jacket most days, brown at one time, but darkened now by grease at the cuffs and elbows, and his knit cap always looked as though it had been shoved on while running out the door. "You building a moon base out there?" Eli called. Kalen stepped from the truck. "Just shopping." Eli glanced into the bed, where bundled insulation board, ducting, and a steel toolbox sat strapped down. "That's a lot of shopping unless you're marrying the place." Kalen shut the door. "I prefer my commitments quieter." Eli laughed. He liked people quickly, but lightly. There was no malice in him, only the carelessness of a man who had not yet been punished often enough for assuming most things would work out. "June says you've got the old chamber open." "June says a lot." "She does." Eli shoved both hands into his jacket pockets, grin lingering. "Town's already naming it, by the way." "That's so?" "Oh yeah, Winter Cave, Snow Bunker, Foxhole Deluxe." Eli tilted his head. "Rowan called it a panic closet." That earned the faintest flicker in Kalen's face, too restrained to call a smile, but close. "Rowan would," he said. He met Rowan Bell later that afternoon at the hardware store. Rowan was the kind of man who looked permanently assembled out of lumber, frost, and opinion. He was in his late 40s, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a heavy neck, a face roughened by weather, and a trimmed beard beginning to go iron gray along the jaw. He had builder's eyes, the habit of judging walls, lines, and materials before he judged people. His Carhartt jacket sat open over a dark hoodie, and his hands bore the shallow cuts and calluses of a life spent working with things that could resist being shaped. "Your Hale House," Rowan said instead of hello. "Apparently." Rowan grunted. "Heard you're putting money into that underground nook." "Some." The older man glanced down the aisle toward the caulk and weatherproofing shelves. You'd be better off improving the upstairs insulation and reinforcing the mudroom access. That shelter space won't matter 9 years out of 10. Kalen picked up a box of fasteners and turned it in his hand. I'm not planning for the 9 easy years. Rowan studied him with a look that was not dismissive so much as unconvinced. People around here know winter. That can be true, Kalen said, and still not be enough. Something in Rowan's face shifted then. Not agreement, but the recognition of another kind of stubbornness. Men who built for a living always recognized it when they found it in others. You ex-military? Rowan asked. Yes. That where you got the bunker habit? Kalen set the box in his cart. That's where I learned weather doesn't care what people call overreaction. Rowan let out a breath that might have been a laugh if he had enjoyed giving anything away too easily. Fair enough. Still think you're overdoing it. I usually do. That night, back at the house, Kalen worked until his shoulders burned. He patched old seams along the chamber walls where fine air leaks had carried cold through hairline gaps. He cleared the vent connection more thoroughly and rigged a temporary filter housing with materials that looked inelegant, but functioned exactly as intended. He measured the chamber twice before deciding where the 2 cots would fit without wasting space. One wall became storage. Another became utility. He kept the center open. Human beings endured confinement better when they could stand without immediately feeling trapped. Orion stayed near, sometimes lying on the basement floor just outside the chamber entrance, sometimes disappearing upstairs to listen at the windows before returning. The dog's presence changed the emotional temperature of the work. He made the place feel less like a hole in the ground and more like a camp being established by 2 living creatures instead of one man rearranging old fear. By the end of the week, the chamber looked less like a buried afterthought and more like the beginning of an answer. That was when Sheriff Nolan Pike came out to see it for himself. He arrived in a county SUV streaked with road salt and stepped out with the heavy, economical movement of a man who wasted neither energy nor language. Nolan Pike's face always looked like it had been carved by Winters and then left unfinished on purpose. He was broad and solid, his dark hair clipped short under a beanie, his features blunt rather than handsome. No visible vanity, no appetite for performance. But there was a steadiness in him Kalen respected instinctively, the kind men developed after years of being the first person called when other people's ordinary lives, sorry lives, split open. Didn't come to inspect, Nolan said after Kalen let him in. Just got curious. Curiosity's free. Usually costs time. They went downstairs together. Orion followed at Kalen's side, glanced once at Nolan, and accepted him without fuss. That, too, mattered. Dogs did not always love lawmen. Nolan stood at the chamber entrance for a long moment, taking it in. The old sheriff did not laugh. He stepped inside, touched one wall with gloved fingers, crouched briefly near the floor vent line, and tipped his head back to judge the height and geometry. Smaller than people imagined, he said. Better built than they imagined, too. Nolan gave one quiet nod. Yeah. When they came back upstairs, he removed his gloves slowly and stood near the kitchen sink, looking out toward the ridge. Town's gotten used to being looked after, he said. Plows, utility crews, forecasts, state road access. People remember bad winters, but they remember surviving them with infrastructure attached. Kalen leaned a shoulder against the counter. That makes them trust the wrong things. Sometimes. Nolan's mouth tightened. Sometimes it just makes them tired of being afraid. That landed more deeply than Kalen expected. He knew something about exhaustion masquerading as certainty. People often called others careless, when what they really meant was worn thin. You could not live forever in active respect of disaster. The mind protected itself by normalizing risk, until risk looked like weather, and weather looked like scenery. Nolan glanced back at the basement stairs. I still think some folks are going to laugh. They already are. Does it bother you? Kaelin considered that, honestly. No, but I notice it. That evening, after Nolan left, a strange stillness settled over the house. Not eerie, not dramatic, just a hush so complete that every small sound gained shape. The kettle on the camp stove, the scratch of Orion's claws shifting against the floorboards, the faint, distant ping of cooling metal from a tool laid near the mudroom. Outside, sunset spread over the snow with a pale copper softness that made the world look almost tender. That was when the rehook came. Kaelin was carrying a sealed bin of supplies down toward the basement, when Orion, halfway across the kitchen, stopped as if some invisible hand had laid 2 fingers against his spine. The dog did not bark. He turned slowly toward the back windows, ears high, body fixed in a line of total attention. Then, with a low urgency Kaelin had heard only a few times before, Orion crossed the room and pressed his nose near the glass. Kaelin set the bin down and went to him. At first he saw nothing unusual. Snowfield, fence line, the dark rise of the ridge. Then the light changed. Only slightly. A passing cloud, maybe. Or the angle of evening sun slipping under a higher bank of air. But for one breath-long moment, the snow on the slope behind the house revealed faint, wind-carved contours Kaelin had not noticed before. Long drifts laid in curved pressure lines, deeper and more uneven than they appeared from the yard. It was a subtle thing, more felt than seen, but it gave the hillside a different character entirely. Not peaceful, loaded. Orion let out one soft whine without taking his eyes from the ridge. The sound entered Kaelin like a needle, not because it proved anything mystical, not because it predicted a specific danger, but because the dog's instincts and the shape of the land had aligned again in a way that made mockery seem suddenly childish. Then the light shifted back. The ridge returned to looking like nothing more than snow and shadow. Kaelin rested one hand briefly on Orion's neck. I know, he said. He did not explain it to anyone the next day. There was nothing to explain yet. Just another mark added to the private ledger in his mind. Work continued. He brought in more water, rotated canned goods into bins, installed hooks, labeled storage, adjusted the cot spacing, and found an old steel cabinet at a yard sale just outside town that fit almost perfectly against the interior wall. June sent over 2 extra wool blankets, because every underground hideout in a proper story needs at least 1 decent blanket. And when he tried to pay, she rolled her eyes and threatened to overcharge him forever if he argued. Eli came out one afternoon under the excuse of dropping off a part he claimed Kaelin might need if he was serious about living like a very well-organized mole. He wandered the basement, whistled low when he saw the chamber, and tried not to look too impressed. This is actually... He stopped, searching for a word that wouldn't sound like surrender. Cleaner than I pictured. That's praise from you? Practically poetry. Eli crouched near the storage bins, reading labels. Water, medkit, batteries, dog food. He looked over his shoulder. You really think this place could matter? Kaelin adjusted a vent bracket. I think there are worse habits than being ready. Eli stood there a second longer than needed. For all his humor, he was not stupid. Beneath the easy grin lived the ordinary human wish that someone else's caution might be ridiculous, because if it wasn't, then comfort had been a form of sleep. When he left, he said, "Still looks a little crazy." Kalen nodded. "That's all right." Outside, winter kept sparkling. Inside, the chamber became steadily more real, and somewhere between the laughter in town and the labor below the house, the line had already begun to form, the one people only recognized afterward, when they looked back and realized the thing they had mocked was quietly learning how to save them. The weather did not turn monstrous all at once. That was the first thing Kalen noticed, and later, when people tried to remember the beginning of it, that was the part most of them would get wrong. They would remember the sliding snow, the broken lines, the buried porches, the white silence after impact. But danger had not arrived like a beast leaping from the dark. It had arrived the way most real danger did, quietly, in layers, while people kept living inside the ordinary shape of their days. For nearly a week, Briar's End had gone on shining. Morning after morning, the town woke under a bright shell of winter beauty. Blue-white light over the road, smoke lifting from chimneys, truck tires crunching over packed snow, children walking in thick coats with mittened hands swinging at their sides. The grocery store stayed open. June kept her diner warm and full. Rowan Bell cursed at frozen lumber deliveries and drank his coffee too hot. Sheriff Nolan Pike took calls about snow fencing, generators, one drunk argument outside the feed store, and the usual low-grade emergencies that made up most of a small town's relationship with winter. And all the while, the snow kept coming. Not blizzard snow. Not yet. Just one steady fall after another, each storm small enough to manage. Each new layer laid over the last, with a polite, almost innocent precision. The plows handled Main Street. People shoveled porches. School closed one day, reopened the next, then closed again. An inch here, 3 there, then another 6 overnight. The rhythm was familiar enough that nobody wanted to call it a warning. Then came the brief thaw. It lasted less than a full day. A strange, almost spring-soft breath moved through from the south, lifting the temperature just enough to make the top layers sweat and sag. Icicles wept from roof lines. Gutters dripped. Snow softened on the shoulders of the road, and then, as quickly as it had loosened, everything froze again. That refreeze changed the town. Kalen could feel it under his boots before he had language for it. The upper layer hardened. The lower drifts settled. Places that had looked soft now held tension. The ridge behind the house no longer appeared merely snow-covered. It looked assembled. He had not said that to anyone. What he said instead, when Nolan stopped by one afternoon and found him outside checking the rear grade, was simpler. The slopes building unevenly. Nolan stood with his gloved hands on his belt, looking up toward the north ridge where the white ran down in long swells through dark pines. It's been doing that longer than either of us have lived. Kalen crouched to examine the crust near the back of the house. This year it layered wrong. Nolan said nothing at first. That was one of the things Kalen respected about him. The sheriff did not rush to either agreement or dismissal. He let a thought stand in the cold until it either held its own weight or collapsed. Finally, he asked, "You want me to warn people?" Kalen straightened. "About what, exactly? There's no one sentence that doesn't sound dramatic." Nolan's mouth tightened. That's the problem with most real trouble. They left it there. By then, the shelter below the house was ready enough to matter. Not finished in any proud sense, places like that were never finished, only improved until time interrupted but stocked, sealed, measured, and functional. Water was stored. Blankets were folded. Medical supplies were arranged in bins. A compact battery station sat charged on a shelf beside the radio. Orion's food was sealed tight. 2 cots stood against one wall, with room left open in the center so no one trapped down there would feel the ceiling pressing into their skull. June had seen it 2 days earlier. She had come out under the excuse of dropping off a cast iron pot she claimed every remote house deserved, and though she had tried to stay casual when Kaylin led her below, she had gone unusually quiet once she stepped inside the shelter. June Alder wore winter the way some women wore good tailoring, with competence so natural it became a kind of grace. That day, her thick chestnut hair was tucked up under a knit hat the color of dark wine, and the cold had touched her cheeks pink beneath skin that still held the warmth of kitchens and human company. She had a practical figure, strong through the shoulders and hips from years of carrying trays, lifting boxes, and standing through long shifts. Her sharp eyes missed little. Her kindness was real, but it had structure to it. She did not hand it out carelessly. Standing in the shelter, she had turned slowly once, taking in the cots, bins, radio, venting, lamp, blankets. "This is—" she had begun. Kaylin waited. She looked at him and gave a short breath of something that was not quite laughter. "This is either the most sensible, foolish thing I've ever seen, or the most foolish, sensible thing. I've been called worse. I'm sure you have." She ran her fingers lightly over one of the folded blankets. "You built this to be used." "Yes." June nodded slowly. "That's why people laugh, you know." He had looked at her then. "Because if it ever needs to be used," she said, "they'd have to admit they were wrong about more than just you." He remembered that now as he watched the weather tighten. The day everything broke began with stillness, not the peaceful kind, not the crystalline hush of postcard snow. This stillness felt arranged. The sky sat low and white, not storm dark but pressurized, as if some giant hand had placed a lid over the whole northern edge of town. Sound traveled badly. Orion noticed first, though not in the way he had before. He did not fix on the ridge or the back windows. He moved restlessly between rooms, then came back to Kaylin and stood too close, shoulder pressing against his thigh. Kaylin looked down at him. Orion's ears were forward but unsettled, his amber eyes watchful, his mouth closed. No whining, no barking, just presence. A dog with too much instinct for comfort. That morning, Kaylin drove into town for lamp fuel and spare batteries, more because he wanted one last circuit of normalcy than because he truly needed anything. Briar's End looked subdued. Fewer people out. More trucks idling. Rowan Bell stood outside the hardware store with 2 other men, talking with his jaw set harder than usual and his beard bright with frost. Eli Mercer was across the street trying to help an older woman back her sedan out of a drifted parking angle. All motion and noise as usual. But even from a distance, Kaylin could see the energy in him had sharpened. Inside the diner, the mood had gone quieter than the room itself required. June was pouring coffee for 3 men in hunting caps, who were not really there for coffee. Nolan sat at the counter with a folded county weather bulletin open in front of him. "What changed?" Kaylin asked. Nolan tapped the paper once. "Not a storm warning. More like a localized slide advisory up north of the county line. Nothing official for us." His face stayed unreadable. "But the temperature drop tonight is steeper than they expected." June slid a mug toward Kaylin. "Everybody's suddenly remembering they own shovels." "That's still a useful memory," he said. She held his gaze a second longer than necessary. "You staying at the house today?" "Yes." A pause. Then June said, quieter, "If the road gets ugly—" She did not finish the sentence. Kalen understood anyway. If the road got ugly, the distance between town and the ridge would become more than miles. He returned home before noon. The first sign came not as movement, but as sound. Late afternoon. He was in the mudroom checking weather stripping along the rear door when a deep, muffled thud passed through the ground under his boots. Not a sharp crack. Not thunder. Something slower. As if a giant weight somewhere beyond the visible edge of the world had shifted 1 inch and settled. Orion froze in the kitchen doorway. Kalen stepped outside. The sky remained white and close. Wind had begun to move, not fast, but in low directional pushes that drove loose snow in thin sheets across the yard. He stared toward the ridge, but from the house he could not see enough of its upper slope to know what had moved. Then the radio on the shelf inside crackled with Nolan's voice, clipped by static. "Kalen, you there?" He grabbed the handset. "Here. We just lost 1 utility pole on Birch Lane from ice load. Nothing major yet." A pause of static. "But Rowan says the upper shoulder near the old service cut is shedding chunks." Kalen looked again toward the rise beyond his property. "I'm staying put." "Good. And if you see anything, move." The rest disappeared into a hiss. He set the radio down. The rehook came minutes later. He was fastening the mudroom latch when Orion suddenly spun, rushed to the back of the house, and stopped not at the door, but at the floor directly over the line where the hidden chamber lay below. The dog braced his legs wide, head lowered, not in fear but in focus so intense it seemed to pull the room tighter around him. Then Kalen felt it. Not a noise this time. A tremor. So slight another man might have dismissed it as imagination. A low traveling vibration rising through the boards, through the bones of the house, through his boots and knees and spine. Orion's eyes lifted to his. For 1 breath-long moment, man and dog stood in complete understanding without language between them. Something was coming down. Then the world moved. It did not roar first. It struck. From beyond the rear line of the property came a crushing, sliding impact so heavy it sounded less like snow and more like an entire section of winter being shoved by force. White exploded past the back windows. The house shuddered. A hard concussion hit the mudroom wall. Somewhere outside, wood snapped with a gunshot crack. Then another. Kalen moved on instinct. "Basement," he ordered, already clipping a lead to Orion's harness. "Move." He did not go down into the shelter yet. First came assessment. He hit the front room windows. Visibility bad. Snow and fractured ice sweeping sideways. The road beyond the trees gone in white turbulence. He checked the rear again and saw enough to understand the shape of disaster. Not an avalanche in the mountain sense, but a partial hillside slide snow, ice crust, and churned earth slumping and driving forward as one dense mass off the ridge's lower shoulder. It had not struck the house directly with full force, but the runout had spilled through the outer properties like a thrown wave, burying edges, crushing fences, and loading porches and side entries with lethal weight. Power flashed once and died. The silence afterward was worse. No hum from the refrigerator, no overhead buzz, just the ticking of settling wood and Orion's breathing. Then came the first distant shout. Human. Kalen was already moving when the second one sounded. He shrugged into his coat, grabbed a shovel, a pry bar, flashlight, and med kit, then headed for the front door with Orion lunging ahead, all restraint now transformed into purpose. Outside, the world had become a maze of drift, broken branches, and hard-packed collapse. The air cut at exposed skin like ground glass. Across what had once been the open gap between properties, Martha Wren's porch sagged under a shoulder of compacted snow and ice. Her front steps had disappeared entirely. One shutter banged uselessly against the siding. Kalen could not see her. "Martha!" he shouted. No answer. Then June. Not at her diner here, impossibly, on foot between houses in a parka the color of faded green canvas, a scarf lashed at her throat, face white with cold and anger. She was half supporting, half dragging a young mother Kalen recognized only vaguely from town, along with a little boy bundled in blue so thickly he looked more fabric than child. "She was at Martha's," June shouted over the wind. "Garage side gave way." The mother was new to him, and in another hour he might have noticed more gently that she was young late 20s, perhaps, with a narrow, exhausted face, pale skin gone raw in the cold, and blonde hair escaping in wet strands from under a wool hat. Fear had stripped her features down to something painfully pure. She was not hysterical. Hysteria required room. She was beyond that, reduced to the brutal economy of a parent whose child was still breathing, and therefore all thought must stay pointed forward. Kalen reached them fast. "Who's still inside?" "Martha," June said. "And maybe Eli, he went around back to help." Of course he had. There was no time to think about the irony of that. The same Eli who had joked about foxholes and winter caves was now somewhere in the white mess beyond the sagging line of porches, probably digging with bare hands if nobody had stopped him. "Take the boy to my house," Kalen said. "Front room first, then basement if I tell you." June opened her mouth, probably to argue, then saw something in his face and changed direction without wasting breath. "Come on," she told the mother, and the two of them lurched toward his house through knee-deep, churned snow. Kalen turned toward Martha's place. Orion was already pulling hard in that direction, nose driving into the wind, body low and determined. Behind them, somewhere farther down the line of houses, another cry went up, closer to panic now, closer to pain. The ridge had finally leaned on the wrong wall. And the only thing in Kalen's mind as he ran into the whitening chaos was a single, ruthless fact. The shelter below his house was no longer an idea anyone got to laugh at. The first rescue took less than 3 minutes and felt like an hour. By the time Kalen reached Martha Wren's porch, the old woman was no longer visible from the road at all. The slide had swallowed the lower half of the structure in a dense white mass that was not the soft, forgiving snow of postcards and Christmas songs. This was snow packed with ice, bark, splintered branches, roof fragments, and the hard indifference of gravity. It had weight. It had memory. It had come downhill with enough force to decide where doors ended and walls began. Orion hit the drift first, front paws carving at the base of what had once been steps. "Martha!" Kalen shouted again. This time he got an answer thin, muffled, but real. "Here!" He followed the sound toward the left side of the porch, where one railing post still showed above the impact line. He dropped to one knee and drove the shovel in. The packed snow fought him like frozen concrete. It was not enough to scrape. He had to cut blocks, pry, throw, cut again. Orion kept working beside him, digging where the air smelled different, then shifting when Kalen barked a correction. The dog was fast, disciplined, and absolutely committed, but even his strength looked small against the amount of white pressing down on the little house. Then another shape appeared through the blowing snow. Eli Mercer. He came around the rear side half stumbling, half running, his knit cap gone, blonde-brown hair wet with melt and sweat, his work jacket crusted white to the elbows. His face had lost all its usual loose humor. Fear had sharpened him, pared him down to the younger, harder man underneath the jokes. There was blood on one knuckle, where he must have split it against wood or ice. He carried a flat pry bar in one hand and breathed in quick, ragged bursts. "She's trapped at the side entry," he yelled. "Then dig, don't narrate." Eli actually nodded at that, as if the insult steadied him. Together, they cut a trench toward the sound of Martha's voice. When they finally broke through, they found her wedged in a triangular pocket of air between the porch wall and a collapsed snow shelf. Martha Wren looked as though winter itself had tried and failed to shrink her. Her gray coat was dusted white to the shoulders, her scarf pulled half loose, her thin white hair escaping in wisps from its knot. Her face was bloodless with cold, but her pale eyes remained annoyingly lucid. "You took your time," she said through chattering teeth. Kaelin almost laughed. Almost. He and Eli pulled her free together. She was shockingly light, all bird bones and stubbornness. Orion circled once, pressed briefly against her legs as if confirming she was whole, then looked up at Kaelin with a fixed urgency that meant the work was not over. It wasn't. The young mother June had brought toward the house, had made it safely across the yard with the child. But now another cry rose from farther down, toward the line of homes nearest the service lane. Nolan's voice cut through the wind somewhere beyond sight, directing, counting, swearing once with the force of a man who had just found something worse than inconvenience. Kaelin turned to Eli. "Get Martha to my house. Front room, then basement." Eli took one look at the old woman, then at the blowing wreckage of the neighborhood, and did not argue. He scooped an arm around her shoulders. Martha, even half frozen, spared enough spirit to mutter, "Don't drop me, boy. I'm too old to improve from the fall." Eli gave a breathless, stunned laugh and started toward the house. Kaelin ran toward Nolan. Sheriff Nolan Pike stood knee-deep in churned snow beside what had once been Rowan Bell's side fence. His broad body looked even heavier in the storm light, all weight and command. A man shaped to stand where bad news landed first. Snow clung to the dark stubble along his jaw. His county parka was open at the collar where he had been moving too hard to keep it fastened. Beside him, Rowan Bell was on one knee, shoulder jammed under a bent gate frame, trying to lever it away from a buried path. Rowan's beard was white with frost, his weather-cut face red with strain. His left shoulder hung oddly low beneath his jacket. Pain had stripped some of the certainty from him, but not his willingness to keep pushing at something too heavy. "There's a kid in the garage room," Nolan shouted over the wind. "Door's jammed. Mother made it out front, boy didn't." Kaelin took the pry bar from Rowan without asking, and forced himself into the narrow seam between the drifted frame and the sagging side structure. The weight of the snowslide had twisted the outer wall just enough to bind the door. He could hear the child now, a frightened, high animal sound more than language. "Back from the frame!" Kaelin shouted through the crack. "Back now!" A sob, then movement. He wedged the bar, set his boots, and drove his shoulder forward with everything the years had left him. Once. Twice. The warped jam screamed. The third shove broke it loose far enough to open a slot. A small body lunged through into his arms. The boy was maybe 7, bundled in a red coat gone white at the sleeves, his round face wet with tears and cold, cheeks burning scarlet under pale skin. He clung like drowning people clung. Kaelin passed him instantly to Nolan, who wrapped him close under his own coat without softness, but with perfect competence. Take him to the house, Kaelin said. Nolan hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but Kaelin saw it. The sheriff looking at him, looking at the property behind him, looking at the road already disappearing beneath drift and wreckage, and understanding the arithmetic with painful speed. Your house. Your shelter. Go, Kaelin said. Nolan went. By the time Kaelin got back, June had taken over the front room like a field medic disguised as a diner owner. She had the young mother sitting near the wall under blankets, the little boy in red wrapped beside her, and Martha in a chair with a mug pressed between both hands. June moved with an economy that made all tenderness look efficient. Her face had gone pale under the kitchen warmth, but her voice stayed level, the way some women's voices did, only when panic was close enough to smell. The child in blue is wheezing, she said the moment Kaelin entered. Not constant. Intermittent. The boy in question sat on the couch beside his mother, small enough that the oversized blue coat nearly swallowed him. He had wide, gray-brown eyes, a damp knit cap pulled down too far, and the frightened solemnity children wore when they understood disaster not as concept but as the fact that adults were no longer pretending. His breathing hitched every few seconds with a tight little pull in the chest. Name? Kaelin asked. Ben, the mother said. Her voice shook only at the edges. He has asthma, mild, usually mild. Not tonight, June said quietly. Kaelin knelt once in front of the child. Ben, look at me. The boy did. We're going downstairs in a minute. It's warmer there. Safer, too. Ben nodded because brave children often did what they were told before they understood the cost of obedience. There were 7 of them now. Plus Orion. Kaelin counted automatically. Himself. June. Martha. Ben. Ben's mother. The red-coated boy and his mother from Rowan's property. Nolan would likely return if he could. Eli already had. That was the problem with being the one who prepared. Your kindness got measured in square feet and oxygen without your permission. He stood and made the call. Everyone downstairs, now. No one argued. The transition into the shelter was uglier than he had imagined when he built it. No dramatic reveal, no cinematic awe. Just tired, frightened people moving through the basement with bad footing and damp clothes, carrying children, clutching coats, trying not to look at each other too directly. The hidden chamber had seemed decently sized when Kaelin worked there alone. With bodies in it, even careful bodies, it shrank at once into fact. Breath, fabric, fear. The air changed immediately. June guided the mothers and children to the cots. Nolan returned with Rowan 10 minutes later, the builder white with pain but upright, his left arm tucked uselessly against his side. That made 8 adults and 2 children if Nolan stayed. Too many. Kaelin saw the calculation on Nolan's face as well. I can cycle back to town center, Nolan said. No, Kaelin answered. Not in this. The sheriff looked as though he wanted to object on principle. Then Ben coughed again, harsh and tight, and the argument died unborn. So Nolan stayed. That was the shape of the shelter now. Too many people, not enough room, and no one with the luxury of pretending otherwise. Kaelin switched on the battery lamps. Warm light filled the chamber in soft amber pools that somehow made the concrete walls feel both smaller and more human. June took immediate charge of the children. She stripped wet gloves, rubbed hands, rearranged blankets, and talked in the tone one used for both baking and triage firm enough to anchor, gentle enough not to shame fear. The young mother in blue, whose name turned out to be Cora Ellis, had a narrow face and fair hair stuck in damp strings to her temples. She looked like someone who had been surviving on very little sleep for a long time, even before tonight. The other mother, Denise Bell Rowan's sister-in-law was darker-haired, fuller in the face, with a split lip and furious eyes that had not yet decided whether to cry or bite someone. Fear lived differently in different people. Martha refused the cot and took the folding chair instead. "Children first," she snapped, when June tried to insist. Rowan sat against the wall, breathing through his teeth while Nolan checked the shoulder. "Probably not broken," Nolan muttered. "You'd be louder if it was." "That's comforting," Rowan said. It was somewhere in the second hour. Once wet outer layers had been stripped, and the room had settled into the rough order of crisis, that the re-hook came. Ben had been breathing badly enough that every adult in the room was listening without meaning to. June knelt beside him, one hand on his back, Cora near tears, but holding herself together through sheer maternal force. Kaylin was digging through the med kit for the emergency inhaler Cora swore had been in her bag, when Orion rose from his place near the entrance and crossed the chamber without a sound. He went straight to Ben. The German Shepherd lowered himself beside the couch and pressed the length of his warm body against the child's legs, then lifted his head until it rested lightly against the boy's knee. Nothing flashy. No clever trick. No trained comfort dog theatrics. Just steady warmth, calm breathing, and a presence so composed that the whole room unconsciously took its rhythm from him. Ben's hand, tiny and trembling, came down into the thick fur at Orion's neck. The boy's next breath still hitched, but less. Then another, then one more, ragged but deeper. June looked up sharply. So did Kaylin. So did everyone. It was not magic. It was not healing. It was a frightened child borrowing calm from another living creature whose nervous system had not panicked. But the effect passed through the room like mercy all the same. For a brief, impossible moment, the shelter stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like a place where life might actually hold. Nobody said it out loud. They did not need to. Later, when the children were quieter and the adults had moved from panic into the harsher work of waiting, the tensions began. Rowan wanted to know how long the battery station would last. Nolan wanted radio check windows and head counts every hour. Denise kept asking if someone should try for the road. Cora wanted to know whether Ben's breathing sounded worse when the room got warmer. Eli, who had come in last with one glove missing and both hands raw from digging, paced the narrow corridor twice before Kaylin stopped him with a look. "No pacing," Kaylin said. Eli stared back, breath fast. "I'm just moving. You're burning heat and making the room smaller." That landed. Eli dropped onto an overturned crate and dragged both hands over his face. Without the easy grin, he looked suddenly very young. Rowan broke the silence next. "You really thought this through?" It was not an apology. Not yet. But it was the first clean thing he had said to Kaylin since the storm began. "I thought some of it through," Kaylin said. June, kneeling by the storage bins, let out a tired breath that might once have been a laugh. "That's more than the rest of us managed." Nolan sat near the entrance with the radio balanced on one knee, listening to static and the occasional broken voice from somewhere else in the county. "Road crews are cut off north side," he said at last. "Main plow routes blocked. They're prioritizing the center roads and medical access." He looked around the chamber. "We may be here a while." No one answered that, because now they could all feel it. The true size of the night was no longer outside. It was in the room with them, in the packed bodies, in the rationed light, in the knowledge that there would be no easy walk back to normal by morning. Kaylin moved through his checks again: vent line, power draw, water count, med supplies, blankets, spacing. Ritual against fear. System against helplessness. He had built the shelter to hold. Now he had to become the man who could make it work under the weight of actual lives. When he finally paused near the entrance, Orion lifted his head from where he lay beside Ben and looked at him. There was trust in that gaze. Not blind trust dogs were too honest for that, but the simple certainty of a creature that had chosen its place beside him long ago and intended to stay there. Kalen put a hand on the concrete wall and felt, beyond the human sounds inside, the muffled pressure of the storm-choked world above them. The people here had laughed while the sky was blue. Now they sat under the house in a buried room, built by a dead man they had called Strange, breathing air through vents they had never believed would matter, waiting on the judgment of weather and luck and each other's endurance. And the shelter beneath the laughter had finally become what it was always meant to be. Not a dead-end curiosity, but a place where frightened people could go and remain alive long enough to change their minds. By the morning of the 6th day underground, the shelter had begun to feel less like a room and more like a held breath. Nothing had failed all at once. That was what made it worse. The battery lamps still worked. The radio still spat static and broken syllables from somewhere beyond the buried white world. Water remained, rationed and counted. The children slept in uneasy folds of blanket and exhaustion. But the air had changed. It had grown heavier, not foul exactly, but used. The warmth no longer moved cleanly through the chamber. Moisture clung longer to sleeves and hair. Every breath seemed to arrive a fraction later than it should have, as though the room wanted to think before giving it back. Kalen felt it first in his own body. A faint pressure behind the eyes. A dullness at the base of the skull. The kind of thing a tired man could blame on too little sleep, unless he had spent enough years in sealed rooms and bad compounds to know the difference between fatigue and atmosphere. He checked the vent line twice before saying anything, then a third time. The intake was still drawing, but weaker. Not enough to panic anyone. Enough to worry him. He crouched beside the pipe housing in the corner of the chamber, one hand resting against the metal. Cold, but not properly alive with moving air. Above it, the filtered intake gave only a shallow whisper where before there had been a steadier pull. He looked up at the ceiling without really seeing it. June noticed anyway. She had become quieter over the last several days, not because she had less to say, but because she had learned that underground calm needed to be rationed as carefully as water. Even tired, she retained that practical grace of hers. Sleeves rolled, hair tied back with the looseness of someone who no longer wasted energy on appearances, face paler than usual, but composed. She was kneeling near the children's blankets, sorting canned peaches into portions with a plastic spoon, when she said very softly, "What is it?" Kalen stood. "The airflow's dropping." Across the room, Nolan Pike lifted his head from the radio. The sheriff looked older underground. Not weaker, there was too much iron in him for that, but older. The shadowed chamber drew attention to the lines weather had cut around his eyes, and the graying in the stubble he had not bothered shaving. He had become, over the last few days, a man made almost entirely of function. Listening, counting, checking time, checking people. He set the radio aside. "How bad?" "Not critical yet." Kalen kept his tone level. "But the intake's partly obstructed. Snowpack probably shifted again above the rear line. If it seals tighter, the circulation drops with it." The room went very still. Not because anyone fully understood the mechanics. Because they understood his face. Cora Ellis, Ben's mother, pressed one hand unconsciously against her son's shoulder. Cora had not slept properly since the slide. Her fair hair, usually neat by instinct, now hung in loose, tired strands around her narrow face. She had the drawn look of women who had been holding themselves together so long they no longer remembered what relaxation felt like, but she did not interrupt. None of them did. Rowan Bell sat against the wall with his bad shoulder bound and immobilized, his broad builder's frame forced into an awkward stillness that seemed to insult every habit in him. His beard had gone rougher with the days, and humility sat on him like a coat he had never expected to wear. Eli, across from him, had stopped pacing days ago because Kaelin had ordered it once and never needed to repeat himself. That alone said something about how fear had changed him. "We clear it from inside?" Nolan asked. "No." The answer came from Kaelin immediately, and with a finality that made the children glance up. He crouched and pulled a folded sketch from the shelf, his copy of the old subgrade layout, worn at the corners now. He spread it on a storage bin. "The intake comes in from the rear rise. It's too narrow to access from here, without cutting into old concrete, and even if we tried, we'd lose more air in the process. The blockage is outside." June understood first. Her mouth parted, but she did not speak. Nolan did. "You're going up." Kaelin nodded once. The words settled over the room like fresh snow over a roof beam. He had known this was coming the moment he touched the weakening vent line. In truth, he had known it years before this house ever belonged to him. Every shelter, every plan, every place built to hold against bad odds eventually arrived at the same brutal fact. Survival still demanded that someone go where the danger lived. "I'll go," Eli said. The speed of it made several people turn. Eli Mercer was pale, unshaven, and visibly tired. His hands still healing in raw pink lines beneath fresh bandages from the rescue work days earlier. But something fundamental in him had changed. The careless brightness had not vanished. It had been cut back to reveal the grain beneath. He still looked young compared to Nolan and Rowan, still had that quick-featured face and strong mechanic's shoulders, but the storm had burned away the illusion that joking could keep consequence at a distance. Kaelin looked at him. "You don't know the route. Then show me. You'll slow me down." "Maybe." Eli swallowed. "Or maybe you're not hauling ice and digging alone with half the town breathing through one pipe." There it was. Not bravery in the cinematic sense. Something harder and less graceful. A frightened man deciding he was still available for use. Nolan rose as if to argue. But before he could, the rehook came. Orion, who had been lying near Ben's blanket, stood abruptly and crossed to the steel door at the chamber entrance. He did not bark. He pressed his nose low against the seam where the cooler air gathered, and then looked back over his shoulder at Kaelin. The dog's amber eyes held that same old, unadorned certainty they always had when something real aligned inside him. Then Orion did something he had not done once since they entered the shelter. He scratched once, sharply at the lower metal edge of the door. Not panic. Not demand. A signal. Kaelin understood at once, and understanding sent a strange chill through him that had nothing to do with temperature. The dog was not warning against the outside. He was pointing toward it, toward the threshold, toward movement, toward the fact that waiting had become the more dangerous choice. For one suspended moment, with all those people watching, Kaelin felt the old, impossible comfort of being seen by another living thing without explanation. June lowered her eyes first, as if she did not want to intrude on whatever wordless pact had just passed between man and dog. Kaelin exhaled slowly. "Eli comes with me." Nolan opened his mouth again. "You stay," Kaelin said. "If the intake worsens, someone here has to keep the room calm and the radio going. That's you." A beat, Then the sheriff gave one curt nod. He hated the logic, which meant he recognized it. The preparations took only minutes. There was no drama to them, only procedure. Cold weather outer layers, goggles, rope line clipped through improvised anchor points, 2 compact shovels, 1 hatchet, pry bar, utility knife. Eli's gloves were doubled because of his healing hands. Kalen checked every strap twice, then once more. June added 2 heat packs to his coat pocket without a word. Cora whispered something to Ben as the child watched with wide, solemn eyes. When Kalen knelt beside him, Ben asked in a small voice, "Are you coming back?" Children almost never asked the wrong question. "Yes," Kalen said. He did not add, "I'll try." He did not insult the moment with honesty too fragile to hold. He simply let the words stand, and hoped the house above them, and all the other things men called luck when they did not want to kneel before them, would honor it. They went up through the basement, through the kitchen, through the rear of the house, where the outer world pressed white and hard against every visible surface. The door opened with effort. Light hit them like a blade. Outside, Briar's End had become an anatomy of snow. The yards no longer read as yards. Fences vanished halfway down. Porches looked amputated. Roof lines hunched under enormous white burdens. The air was bitter enough to punish exposed skin instantly, and the wind moved in quick, mean gusts that cut across the buried edges of the properties and found every weakness in clothing. Kalen led. Eli followed on the line. They angled not toward the road, but toward the rear rise where the intake emerged. Progress was slow, ugly work. The snow there was not powder, but compacted mass, layered and glazed, hard enough that each step had to be tested before weight committed. More than once, Eli slipped and caught himself on one knee, cursing through his scarf. Kalen said nothing, unless instruction was needed. At the slope, the damage finally made sense in full. A section of wind-loaded accumulation from the upper shoulder had broken and slumped days earlier, not in one clean avalanche, but in dense, staggered collapses. Some of that heavy mass had carried ice crust, broken limbs, and earth with it. It had spread low and wide, enough to bury access points and seal exposed lines. The intake cap, protruding from the rise behind the house, was almost entirely swallowed by packed snow and frozen debris. "There!" Kalen shouted. They dug. Time became muscle, breath, impact. Shovel, pry, pull, clear, repeat. The wind stole heat through every seam. Eli's damaged hands made each effort costlier, but he did not complain. He worked with the desperate rhythm of a man who had discovered that usefulness could be holier than pride. At one point, the shovel glanced off something solid below the crust-knot pipe, but wood. A broken branch jammed deep across the intake hood, packed in place by refrozen snow. Kalen hacked at it with the hatchet. The angle was bad. The branch shifted, resisted, then held fast. His left forearm began to cramp. Eli saw it. "Move!" he shouted. Kalen didn't. Eli looked straight at him through iced lashes and said, with startling steadiness, "Move." The mechanic wedged himself lower on the slope, braced both boots, and drove the hatchet in with his good leverage instead of brute force. The branch split on the third strike. He tore the halves free with a raw sound that might have been pain, or triumph, or both. Underneath, the metal intake cap showed itself at last, bent but intact. Kalen dropped to one knee and cleared the packed ice from the mesh. A deep, hungry pull answered almost immediately from within the pipe. Fresh airflow. Even through gloves, he could feel the change in the metal. For a second, neither man moved. The wind whipped past them, the town below half buried and ghostly in white. Then Eli laughed, once short, disbelieving, almost angry. Kalen turned toward him, and what he saw in the younger man's face was not relief alone. It was recognition. Of the house. Of the room beneath it. Of the fact that the ridiculous thing he had joked about had just become the hinge between breath and suffocation. They made their way back slower than they had gone out. Inside the house, the difference was not dramatic, but it was there. The shelter air moved again. Cooler. Cleaner. June noticed first when they descended. Nolan said nothing at all, only reached over and gripped Eli's shoulder once in passing. The kind of gratitude men like him rarely translated into language. That night, nobody slept deeply, but nobody stopped breathing either. The next morning the storm had quieted. Not ended. Quieted. Silence settled over the buried neighborhood with an almost sacred force. People listened to it the way sailors listened after cannon fire. Then, sometime near noon, the radio crackled hard enough to pull every head toward Nolan's hands. A county voice. Broken, but real. Road crews. North access. Partial progress. Hours later came the sound itself. Heavy machinery. Distant at first. Then nearer. A mechanical growl pushing against the deadened white world above them. Rescue did not arrive like miracle. It arrived like labor diesel, steel, shovels, men in layered orange and reflective tape. When they finally opened the house and stepped out into the brutal brightness, Briar's End looked transformed and humiliated all at once. The ridge still stood. The houses still stood, mostly. But the easy confidence had been crushed out of the landscape. June was the first to laugh once, tiredly, at the sheer offense of the sunlight after so many days below. Nolan spoke to the crews. Cora wept without sound. Ben wrapped both arms around Orion's neck before being carried toward medical checks. Denise and her son stood blinking like people returned from underwater. Rowan Bell lingered by the rear line of the property, staring at the rise, and then at the house, and then finally at the hidden geometry beneath them all. His big builder's face had gone strangely unguarded. He turned to Kalen. "I used to think a dead end was just wasted effort," he said. Kalen looked out over the crushed drifts, the torn fences, the white wreckage that had remade the neighborhood's logic. "Not every road has to lead out," he said. Rowan nodded once, as if accepting not only the sentence but the debt inside it. By evening, when the first proper path had been cut through and the worst of the buried edges exposed, Briar's End had already begun the long human work of retelling itself. Some would call it luck, some would call it timing. Some would say Kalen Voss had been overly cautious and simply happened to be right in the one season it mattered. But the people who had sat below his house knew better. They had breathed because a dead man once built a room no one respected. They had survived because another man, years later, looked at that room and understood what it was for. And when Kalen stood at last on the back side of the house, with Orion at his knee, looking toward the ridge under a sky gone cold and clear, he understood something simple enough to last. Some paths were meant for escape. Some were meant for arrival. And some, the most easily mocked of all, existed for one sacred purpose only, to hold. In the end, this story is not only about snow, survival, or a hidden shelter beneath an old house. It is about something many people forget until life corners them. Sometimes God's protection does not arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it is not loud. Sometimes it is not dramatic. Sometimes it looks like wisdom people laughed at, a door no one valued, a warning no one wanted to hear, or the quiet instinct that tells a faithful heart to prepare before the storm arrives. What looked like paranoia became provision. What looked like a dead end became mercy. And maybe that is how grace often works in real life. God does not always remove the mountain, calm the storm immediately, or keep us from walking into hard seasons, but He can place shelter where others see foolishness. He can plant discernment in one person to save many. He can turn preparation into protection, fear into humility, and survival into a second chance. In everyday life, the storms may not come as snow or collapsing hillsides. They come as sickness, financial pressure, heartbreak, loneliness, betrayal, exhaustion, or the quiet weight of a world that suddenly feels too heavy. And in those moments, the lesson is the same. Not every path that saves you looks impressive. Not every blessing arrives wrapped in comfort. Some of God's greatest miracles are hidden inside ordinary things we almost ignored. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment and ask yourself, what has God already placed in your life that you once overlooked? Was it a warning, a person, a delay, a closed door, a burden that taught you strength, or a quiet place that kept you standing when everything else gave way? If this message meant something to you, please share this video with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story stayed with you most, or share a moment when God protected you in a way you only understood later. And subscribe to the channel if you want more stories about faith, resilience, second chances, and the quiet miracles hidden inside ordinary lives. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, guide your steps, and give you peace in every storm you face. May those who feel tired be renewed, those who feel afraid be comforted, and those who feel alone be reminded that heaven has not forgotten them. Wherever you are tonight, may the Lord watch over you and the ones you love.